Welcome back to Code Corner with Dan Decker, everyone. I'm your host, Krista Poss, Vice President of Sales and Marketing with Midwest Alarm Services. Today, we're going to be building on our previous discussions about the hierarchy of codes and also diving deeper into the first foundational document, the building code. To help us understand its intricacies, I'm once again thrilled to welcome Dan Decker. Dan is our Industry Affairs Manager here at Midwest. Dan, thanks for joining us.
Happy to be here. Always happy to talk about essential building blocks for fire safety.
So Dan, we all know the building code establishes when a fire alarm system is needed and its minimum requirements, including things like horns, voice evacuation, strobes, and smoke detection. But for something so critical, who comes up with these requirements and how are they actually enforced?
That's a great question. Historically, there were three separate organizations, building officials, and they wrote different code books. We had the Building Officials and Code Administrators International. They wrote the BOCA codes. And then there was the International Conference of Building Officials, ICBO, and they wrote something called the Uniform Codes. And then there was a Southern Building Code Congress that wrote the Southern Codes. And then each state or jurisdiction would pick one of these model codes and then modify it to create their specific building code. We still see that to a certain extent in some of the states that we do business in. Wisconsin, Indiana, and Missouri all lack a statewide building code, or if they've got a statewide building code, it's a kind of a default if you don't have something else. So in those three states specifically, each jurisdiction adopts whatever code they want to adopt. Quite a few years ago, we had a situation in Michigan where you could literally stand on a street corner, on one side of the street was the BOCA code, and on the other side of the street was the Uniform Building Code. And they weren't even the same edition. And of course, the codes were written by different people and they had different requirements. So it makes it a challenge where that came from.
So it seems like a bit of patchwork then.
Yes. Yep. It was a lot worse. It changed in 1997. The three organizations, the ICBO, BOCA, and the Southern Building Code Congress International, made a decision to merge into what we now know as the International Code Council. They formed committees. They took a few people from each organization, formed different committees to work on different sections of the code. And so they developed what they call a unified code book, and that was released in the year 2000 as the International Building Code. And of course, that had related codes such as the International Fire Code, the International Mechanical Code, the International Plumbing Code, the Existing Building Code, and the International Residential Code. So those codes are pretty much the basis for what everybody uses today, and they're revised on a 3-year cycle. At Midwest Alarm, we deal with versions ranging from 2012 to 2024 across our service areas. One of the things that I do is do plan reviews for our engineering department and basically look things over before we submit them to an authority having jurisdiction. And it's gotten a lot simpler having essentially one code as the basis for things, and we just have the various additions to deal with. But it seems like a hassle dealing with 6 or 8 different versions of a code, but it's a whole lot better than dealing with 6 or 8 editions of 3 different codes.
Sure, that makes a lot of sense. It also sounds like a lot of reading. I've seen the 2021 International Building Code, and it's a couple of inches thick. How do you even begin approach using it?
It's an intimidating document. If you go to college and have a course with a textbook that size, it's like guaranteed to be a tough course. Over the years, I've picked up some tidbits that make it a helpful resource. The good news is that even if a specific jurisdiction is on a different version than what you're most familiar with, a lot of the requirements are really the same, or they're very similar between editions. The actual language that changes from, say, 2016 to 2019 generally is cleaning up problems. They're not all new requirements.
Okay, let's jump into some key sections then. Where do you usually start?
Usually the best place to start is Chapter 1, which deals with the scope and the administration of the code. It's very useful to kind of put things in perspective. The scope of the International Building Code, it's defined as applying to the construction, alteration, repair, equipment, use and occupancy, and demolition of virtually every building or structure. The main exception is a detached one or two family dwelling. Those are covered by the International Residential Code. Essentially, any construction work on a commercial structure falls under the building code. There's also a section noting that existing buildings are often covered by the International Existing Building Code. In some jurisdictions like Michigan, that's renamed. In Michigan, it's called the Rehabilitation Code. We'll jump into that document in a future discussion. But for the most part, if there's any construction going on, the building code is a document we deal with.
Okay, that's good to know. What about how it relates to other standards like NFPA 72, which we discussed in our last episode?
NFPA 72 is basically a supporting document for the building code. And the building code addresses that. It's aware and relies on what they call reference codes. There's a section in Chapter 1, Section 102.4, and that addresses reference codes and standards. It states that all codes and standards referenced by the building code are considered part of its requirements. So it's not just a document out there that they think you should use. They actually incorporate the NFPA standards that are referenced into the building code. So if there's a violation of an NFPA 72 requirement, essentially it's a violation of the building code. The other thing is there's a potential for conflicts. And if there's a conflict between the requirements of the building code and the requirements of a reference standard, the building code states that it trumps any reference standard. So if, for example, the building code doesn't require pull stations and a reference code does require pull stations, that's a conflict. And it's the building code requirements that take priority. In Chapter 35 of the building code, which is the reference standards, it specifically references NFPA 72, the National Fire Alarm and Signaling Code, along with dozens of other NFPA standards. So those are, in fact, part of the enforced building code. Sometimes we have people say, well, you're putting in kind of a gold-plated system there to comply with NFPA 72. And in reality, NFPA 72 represents the absolute minimum that's acceptable under the building code. If you don't comply with the requirements of NFPA 72, then by definition, you're not complying with the requirements of the building code.
So it's not just a guideline, it's a mandate. I've noticed that the code uses the word shall. Tell us why that's important.
That was lesson number one when I was appointed to the NFPA Technical Committee on Fundamentals of Fire Alarm Systems done 35 years ago. And the difference between shall and should, they're not similar words. In the code world, requirements are in the body of the code. And then there's annex or appendix material, and that's where explanatory material or recommendations are found. So if you've got a word like could, may, should, those are intentionally avoided in the body of the code because they're considered unenforceable language. The code requirements need to be clear and concise and have no ambiguity because it's almost like a speed limit sign with the police officer enforcing it. You can't say, maybe you could travel 35 miles an hour. You specifically says the speed limit is 35 miles an hour. So it's very, very specific, and it's usually factual as to whether you did or did not travel over that limit.
That's a vital distinction, no ambiguity. So tell us what another helpful section is that you use frequently.
Well, we'll keep this one on the down low here, but section 104.1 is titled The Duties and Powers of the Code Official. It's good to know what this says. You might not want to exercise it, but it's good to know. It essentially states that the building official is authorized to enforce the code requirements, to interpret the provisions of the code, and adopt policies to clarify the application. It also says that those interpretations and policies must comply with the code's intent and purpose and cannot waive specific requirements. Essentially, a code official can't create requirements that aren't written in the code, just like the police officer can't say, well, on Wednesdays, the speed limit's really 25 and not 35. and they can't. They don't have the ability to say, yeah, you don't have to comply with that. They have to follow the code. We have to follow the code. It's useful to understand that it's the code that is the defining document and not the code official.
So everyone, including the code official, is obligated to follow the code.
Exactly. On a practical basis, though, sometimes we have to evaluate the situation where a code official asks for more than the code requires. In some cases, the cost of compliance is minimal. If he wants an extra pull station, an extra smoke detector, he wants the strobe intensity turned up a notch, the cost of being right about a code requirement can come back to haunt you. I've always recommended consulting with the building owner when a code official makes an extra request that's going to result in additional funding being required. And in most cases, the building official appreciates being informed, and they'll generally pay the extra money that's required to do what the code official wants, just kind of keep things on a good relationship with that jurisdiction.
That makes a lot of sense. Do you have any examples where that wasn't exactly the case?
Oh, yeah. That did happen. A few years ago, I was involved in a situation where a building was required to have a sprinkler system, but it wasn't required to have a fire alarm system. So all that we were providing was a sprinkler monitoring system. Basically, we were monitoring the flow, the tamper, and had a smoke detector over the panel and a single pull station. And this particular jurisdiction used a third-party firm for plan review. Essentially, they didn't do their own plan review, they farmed it out. And this company had kind of a convoluted reason to come up with buildings that weren't required to have fire alarm systems, require them to have a fire alarm system. I mean, it was kind of silly. We had a building that required a sprinkler system, didn't require a fire alarm system, and their logic went something like, well, you've got a fire alarm control panel to monitor the float switch. So if you've got a fire alarm control panel, then you must have a fire alarm system. If you've got a fire alarm system, then you have to put in notification appliances. And it's like that. It makes no sense, but that's where they came off. We told the plan reviewer, said, this is silly. If the code wanted fire alarm systems in those occupancies, it would say so. And he said, I don't know what you're complaining about. He says, we're both making more money, because he got additional fees when we resubmitted. And of course, we had to charge more money to put in more stuff. In this particular case, the owner of the building owned a lot of buildings of this size in multiple jurisdictions. And he was presented with a proposal for the additional notification appliances, and he was not a happy camper. He knew very well that the code didn't require a full fire alarm system for his business occupancy. And he was not afraid to express his opinion. I heard he contacted the plan reviewer and the code official that essentially hired the plan reviewer and told him, he said, you're requiring me to do something that isn't required by code. If I do that, if I'm forced to do that to get my certificate of occupancy, I will go ahead and do that. But my attorney will be filing a lawsuit against both of you for the additional costs to produce something that's not required by code, all the future maintenance for things that aren't required by code, and my attorney fees.
Wow. So what happened then?
They reconsidered. The plan review was modified to remove the requirements for the additional notification appliances, and the building owner put in the sprinkler supervisory system and nothing more. And I've often thought about that. Not only did he save, some money up front and not having to install it, he was right. The cost of maintaining a system over 20 years is going to be more money for maintenance if you've got twice as much stuff as you would have had otherwise. So that was significant that he knew what he was doing, and he was secure enough to go ahead and challenge the plan reviewer and get things changed.
It certainly highlights the importance of knowing the code inside and out, but that's quite a story, Dan. Beyond the specific requirements, what about the paperwork side of things? Like, what about plans and specifications?
That's also addressed in the code. There's a section in 107 that addresses construction documents, and it addresses who can submit plans and specifications for review. And this is a section that's typically modified by the enforcing jurisdiction to match what they allow in their jurisdiction. Some jurisdictions require drawings that are stamped by a registered design professional, such as an architect or engineer, and others allow fire alarm contractors or licensed fire alarm designers to go ahead and submit plans for approval for a fire alarm system. The code specifically references fire protection shop drawings for submittal and approval before system installation. So it's not one of those things that are likely to fall through the crack. It's called right up front that you've got to have your fire protection shop drawings submitted prior to the installation of the systems. These shop drawings have to contain all of the information that's required by what's called the installation standard that's referenced. In Chapter 9, which is no surprise, the installation standard that's referenced is NFPA 72. And then within NFPA 72, Chapter 7 is a whole chapter on documentation and the specific requirements for shop drawings and submittals.
So it's all interconnected. And speaking of specific requirements, sometimes the interpretation of terms can be tricky, right?
It can be. You think you know what a word means and you roll with it. And the building code, along with most other standards, has a chapter that's dedicated to definitions. Chapter 2 of the code contains definitions which are sometimes incredibly useful to ensure you understand a term that might have meaning that's specific to the code. I remember a situation at a school where we were providing the fire alarm system, and we'd already had approved drawings from the state fire marshal. They'd reviewed everything and stamped them approved. We were in the process of, our electrical contractor was in the process of installation. Within this school, every corridor had a vestibule at the end of the corridor before it went outside. Essentially a windbreak, but it's a really common method of doing corridors in cold weather states. It essentially keeps you from opening the door and having cold air whistle down the corridor. So we had these vestibules at the end. They had an exit sign above the door to the vestibule. We put our pull stations right next to that interior door because the code requirement said that the pull stations had to be within 5 feet of, and the language is, entrance to the exit. Made sense to us. That was this exit sign. Doors were at the entrance to the exit, and that's where we put our pull stations.
Yeah, it sounds pretty straightforward. So what was the issue?
Building inspector walked onto the site, and he'd been to a seminar, and he knew more than the rest of us. And he proceeded to tell the electrical contractor that all the pull stations had to be moved into the vestibule within 5 feet of the outside door. We looked up the definition of exit in the building code, and it stated that the exit is the portion of a means of egress system between the exit access and the exit discharge or public way. And basically, once we finished reviewing all of those terms and tried to put together what it was, essentially the outside door was defined as the exit, and the inside portion of that door was considered the entrance to the exit. So what we assumed was the entrance to the exit was the doors into the vestibule, but what the code actually says when you drill down through the definitions is that the entrance to the exit is the interior surface of the door that leads outside.
A very precise definition.
Exactly. Consequently, the pull stations that were mounted in the vestibule were more than 5 feet from the code's definition of the entrance to the exit, and they had to be relocated. We thought we knew what was meant by the code requirement, and we were wrong. And so that just highlights how important the definitions are and knowing those definitions that apply to our job.
A painful but valuable lesson, it sounds like. Let's move on to Chapter 3, Dan, which is the occupancy classification and use. How is this relevant?
Chapter 3 is incredibly important because that is where it defines various use groups that Chapter 9, the fire protection chapter, uses to determine when fire alarm and sprinkler systems are required. You could take and build a 10,000 square foot building. Would it require a fire alarm system? The answer is maybe. It depends on what's going inside. So if that 10,000 square foot building is a warehouse, probably doesn't need a fire alarm system. If it's a school, it absolutely needs a fire alarm system. So it's the code is focused on what's going into the building, which they define as use groups. So that's what's critical when you're looking at a building, is getting that occupancy classification correct. Sometimes the occupancies are easy to identify, others are more difficult. In new construction, the architect generally provides what the use group is. They usually have a front page with their code page and how the building's classified and how they're exiting and that sort of thing. It might be necessary to check with the building inspector on an existing building to see how he clarifies the classification of the building. There's also something called mixed use occupancies, which are addressed in Chapter 5. But right now, we'll stick to a quick review of the Chapter 3 classifications.
Perfect. Can you walk us through the main ones?
Yep, there's a number of them, and we'll go through them in alphabetical order. Assembly occupancies are classified as Group A, and that's essentially places where people gather. It can be a theater, a football stadium, restaurants, bars, courtrooms, funeral homes, museums, libraries. The fire alarm requirements for these assembly occupancies are based on the maximum occupancy, and they change. If your maximum occupancy is 300, that may be one type of a fire alarm system. If it's 1,000, that's a different type of a fire alarm system. The next occupancy is Group B, which is a business occupancy, and that's facilities that are used for office, professional service organizations such as a bank, data processing center, and post offices. Most buildings that you see are actually classified as Group B. Group E is for educational, and that's specifically defined as buildings that are used by 6 or more people for educational purposes through the 12th grade. So it doesn't have to officially say a school to be a Group E. Around here, there's a company called, I think it was Sylvan Learning Centers, which is essentially does tutoring. Their buildings are used by 6 or more people for educational purposes, so they're Group E occupancies. Group F is a factory occupancy. I think we all know what a factory is, but it covers buildings used for assembling, manufacturing, packaging, or processing operations that aren't classified as hazardous material or storage. If it's hazardous material, we've got a Group H for high hazard, and that applies to buildings where the materials that constitute either a physical or a health hazard are handled. And that can be anything from paint that has a flammability issue to chemicals that may have a health hazard. A big one for the fire alarm world is Group I, institutional occupancies. That's defined as buildings where the care or supervision is provided to occupants that are incapable of self-preservation, is the phrase that's used a lot, without physical assistance. So this would include assisted living facilities, hospitals, nursing homes, prisons, jails, even adult and child daycare facilities can all fall into that, where essentially they can't exit building independently. They need assistance. Group M is a mercantile occupancy, and that's defined as for the display and sale of merchandise, covering department stores, grocery stores, and gas stations. Once they give the examples in the code, it's kind of easy to visualize, okay, this is what you're talking about. Another big one that we deal with is Group R, which is residential. That covers residential occupancies other than 1 and 2 family homes. From a fire alarm perspective, R1, which is hotels and motels, and R2, which is apartments, are key. The main distinction between those two occupancies is that hotel occupants are considered transient. They're less familiar with the building, they're less familiar with the exit paths, and apartment occupants are generally non-transient. They're there every day and less and more familiar with the exit paths and the layout of the building. R3 is another residential occupancy, and that is for what's called congregate living facilities, which is 16 or fewer non-transient occupants all living under the same roof. Here's a fun one that I found in the definitions for Group R3. Convents and sororities are both classified as R3 occupancies. We've got a couple more. Group S is a storage occupancy, and that's buildings used for storage. There have been some recent code changes to buildings used for storage, and we'll cover those in more detail in Chapter 9. Finally, we've got a utility and miscellaneous Group U, which is a catch-all. If you don't fit into one of the categories named earlier, then it becomes a group U.
Great. Thanks for walking us through that, Dan. That wraps up our tour of chapters 1 through 3 of the International Building Code. Dan, this has been incredibly informative in understanding the foundational role of the building code in fire and life safety. So thanks so much for sharing your expertise with us today.
My pleasure, Krista.
That's all the time we have for today's episode of Code Corner with Dan Decker. Thanks for your time, everyone, and stay safe. We'll catch you next time.